All right, let's jump right in. We are about to unpack, wow, one of the most dramatic stories in the entire Old Testament. It's this incredible story about a kingdom that just completely collapses, but also about the amazing promise of hope that rises right from its ashes. And really, it all starts with this one big question. I mean, you have this nation, supposedly chosen for greatness, and then suddenly, they're scattered, they're broken. To even begin to grasp the hope that comes later, we've got to first get a handle on the catastrophe itself. So, what exactly went wrong? Okay, so our story really kicks off at this major turning point, the moment a once unified nation splits apart and then eventually is just destroyed. And you have to understand, this is way more than just a political mess-up. This sets the stage for everything that comes next. So, to get our bearings, let's just quickly walk through this timeline. It all starts after the powerful reign of King Solomon. Boom. The nation splits in two. And from there, things go from bad to worse, fast. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom, that's Israel, gets completely wiped out by Assyria. Then, a little over 100 years later, in 586 BC, it's the southern kingdom's turn. Judah is conquered by Babylon, the temple is totally leveled, and the people are dragged off into exile. This map really gives you a bird's eye view of the whole disaster, doesn't it? You can see the split right there. The kingdom of Israel up north, Judah down in the south. And those big arrows, well, those represent the two superpowers of the day, Assyria and Babylon, basically just swooping in to conquer and deport the people, scattering them all over the ancient world. So the big question is, why? Why did all this happen? Well, at its absolute core, this was a spiritual crisis. See, the people had this covenant, this really sacred agreement with God, but they broke it. And that led to all sorts of problems, widespread idolatry, social corruption, you name it. And according to the terms of their own agreement, the consequences they were warned about finally came due. And those consequences were destruction and exile. Now, right in the middle of all this chaos, a really special group of people emerges. God sends these messengers to explain exactly what's going on and, more importantly, why. These, of course, were the prophets. Yeah, and it's so important to get this right. The prophets weren't just, mystical fortune tellers. A better way to think of them is like God's official spokespeople, or maybe even covenant enforcers. Their whole job was to hold up that agreement the nation had made and basically say, hey, look, these are the blessings you were promised for following the rules, and these are the devastating consequences for breaking them that you were warned about from the very beginning. And the work of the prophets came in different phases, right? So before the exile, you had guys like Isaiah warning everyone about the judgment that was coming. Then, during the exile, you have figures like Ezekiel and Daniel speaking directly to the people in captivity. And then after, prophets like Zechariah pop up to encourage the community that's returned to try and rebuild. The big takeaway here? God was speaking through every single part of this crisis. And this is such a crucial point. We often think of prophets as just predicting the future, right? But a huge, huge part of their job was actually focused on the here and now. They were there to explain that the political and military disasters happening all around them, well, those weren't just random acts of history. No, they were the direct result of the people's own choices and actions. But then, something amazing happens. Right in the middle of all these dire messages of judgment, the prophets do something incredible. They just pivot. They completely change direction. And they start talking about a future hope, a hope so massive it seems to dwarf the current disaster. And wow, does their message shift? The focus flips from present sin and judgment to future restoration. It moves away from the broken national covenant and goes way back to these older, unconditional promises God had made to their ancestor, Abraham. The promises that one day his family would be a blessing to the entire world. And this, right here, is where the vision just explodes. It goes from being about a single exile nation to a future kingdom that would include people from all nations. You have to understand how truly radical this idea was. I mean, in the ancient world, if your God couldn't protect your city from an enemy, well, that meant your God had failed. Simple as that. But the prophets, they say the exact opposite. They say the failure of this earthly, partial kingdom is actually proof that God is up to something much, much bigger, a grander spiritual plan for a prophesied kingdom that was still to come. Okay, so what would this new kingdom even look like? The prophets didn't just offer some vague, fuzzy hope. Nope, they laid out a surprisingly detailed blueprint for what God was planning to build. And it basically rested on three main pillars. First, a new covenant. This time, God's law wouldn't just be on stone tablets. It would be written on people's hearts. It would be internal. Second, it would have a universal scope, finally making good on that old promise to Abraham to bless the whole world. And third, and this is the big one, a righteous king, a new branch sprouting from the seemingly dead royal line of King David. The prophet Daniel really hammers this home. He talks about the permanence of this future kingdom. See, unlike the flashy kingdoms of Assyria or Babylon, this one, the one established by God himself, would be eternal. It would never be destroyed. And the prophets get even more specific about this coming king. They tell us he'd be a descendant of David. His rule, it would last forever. He'd be known as the Prince of Peace, and his government and the peace it brings would never end. In fact, it would just keep on increasing. So this is basically where the Old Testament story starts to wind down. The people are filled with this absolutely incredible hope, but the story isn't finished, not by a long shot. There's this tension you can almost feel. A small group of the exiles does eventually get to return to their homeland. And they get to work. They rebuild the city walls, they rebuild the temple, but it's just not the same. It was obvious to everyone that the grand, glorious promises the prophets had talked about hadn't happened yet. And this contrast really captures that tension perfectly. Think about it. The reality? A small, kind of disappointing temple. The promise? A glorious future kingdom. The reality was that people were still just as sinful as ever. The promise was for a new covenant that would actually change their hearts. And maybe most glaring of all, there was no king on David's throne, but the promise was for an eternal king from that very line. So the conclusion was just unavoidable. The great age of salvation they'd been promised couldn't have arrived yet, and the reason was simple. The king hadn't come. The main character of the whole story was still missing from the stage. And that's exactly where the Old Testament leaves us. The stage is set perfectly. The prophecies have all been made. The people are just watching and waiting, holding on to this incredible promise of a new covenant and a new kingdom. The entire story is left hanging on this one massive question. Who is this king? And when is he finally going to show up?